Today is the most senior bishop of the Church of England, His Grace, the Most Reverend and Right Honourable Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Thanks for coming on One on One.
Thank you, Mr. Stober.
Let me also say welcome to Nigeria. But you've been here so many times, haven't you?
I've been here more times than I can count. I think I gave up when I reached about 70, counting how many times I've been here, since 40 years.
All right. So what has been the experience like?
Well, it's been very varied because for the first many years, I was not ordained. I was not a clergyman. I was working in the oil industry. So I was coming for different reasons, project development, project management. And then later on, I came back as someone involved in mediation, reconciliation, and peace building.
So you have been familiar with so many issues in Nigeria.
Familiar, I think the first lesson I learned about Nigeria was when you arrive, you know nothing. After a year or two, you think you're beginning to understand. And after 40 years, you know that you know less than nothing. It just familiar, nobody's familiar apart from Nigerians.
All right. But you've also been involved in peacemaking, fence mending?
Been involved in peace building and fence mending, as you put it, around the world, including in Nigeria over many years, yes.
But the world today is facing so many challenges that demand peace building, as you say. Why the interest, particularly in this part of the world?
Well, for me, the interest, it's partly that sense of the call of God, of vocation. In the providence of God, I found myself working in Africa a lot. And the Anglican Communion, of which I'm what they call the focus of unity, is largely sub-Saharan African. It's at least half or more of the communion. And so I find myself coming to Africa a lot. As I say, I've been coming to Nigeria for 40 years, to Kenya for 45. They're places that have gripped my heart.
Well, you talk of unity, the place of the church in unity. Would you say attitudes are changing these days? The feelings about how the church religion generally can unite peoples?
I think it's changing in different ways in different parts of the world. It's difficult to give a single view. For many years, people have said the church has been a cause of disunity, of conflict in some ways. And yet, if you look around my own country, around the United Kingdom, you see the churches are working more closely together than they have done in 500 years. And they're working for the common good. They feed the hungry, they house the homeless, they care for those overwhelmed by debt. They provide pastoral care together. They look after people on Friday and Saturday nights when they're out partying. And these are all churches together. They come together for that. So I think we're seeing a new unity of action in the church, although we are still separated quite often by theology.
Right, we'll come to the question of theology later on, but still staying with conflicts. But conflicts would you agree to say conflicts are increasing around the world?
Well, that's a very good question. Funnily enough, I feel that my intuition is the same as what you just said. But the reality of the facts is there's less conflict than there has been. Fewer people are being killed in violent conflicts than probably at any time in human history. The trouble is the potential of conflicts when they begin, because of technology, is much more serious than it ever has been in human history. And so that although the number of conflicts is possibly less, I am told by experts, when they break out, the violence is extreme.
Has technology eroded the power of religion or the church, for instance? I mean, take Christianity, for instance, and what it says about how man got to earth. But science has made so much progress that people sometimes question.
Yes, people question Christian things. But let me be clear, the most powerful event in the whole of the history of the cosmos, never mind even just human history, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And while that event is there, while we know that that is true, which we do, that Jesus died and rose from the dead in the power of God, as Christians we believe nothing can overcome that. The church exists and is called to proclaim the good news of Jesus.
Well, you're sometimes described as one with very strong political views. And here we ask, should the church and the state operate side by side? Or, like some people say, the church should be distinct from the state?
Well, there are lots of models of how the church works. But whatever the model is, so, for instance, in parts of Europe, in Germany, for example, the church is funded by a state tax. It's called the church tax, which the state collects and pays to the church. That does not happen in England. In England, bishops sit in the House of Lords, the upper house of Parliament. In America, there's separation of church and state, as in France. There's lots of different models. But in all these cases, the role of the church is to be obedient to Jesus Christ. I can't speak for other faiths, but the role of the church is to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ, to love and care for the poor, and not to be party political, but to be political. By our nature, we are in every grassroots community, everywhere. We learn what's going on, and we are called to speak up for those who have no other voice.
Well, let's return to theology. You've touched on it briefly, but nowadays you find a rise in what's called the Pentecostal fellowship, and known modes and norms have virtually been turned upside down. Has theology changed?
Theology is, at its best, interaction with God, relationship with God, and expressing that in ways that people can understand. The Greek Orthodox Church says a theologian is someone who prays. And I think that theology has not changed, no. But people rediscover the immense depths and riches of God in different ways, and are thrilled and caught up with the life of God, and in worship and in service to other people. Now, sometimes they get it wrong. In fact, most people get something wrong at some point in their theology. But we are called not to change the fundamental theology of the church, which is the same from time immemorial, but we are called to proclaim it afresh in each generation, which means that if I want to use a more obvious picture, the present, the gift of the good news of Jesus is the same since Jesus Christ. But the packaging may vary from time to time.
Right, so the mode of worship might differ from place to place.
Of course it differs from place to place. People have different cultures, different understandings, different ways of expressing emotion. I mean, that's true even within Nigeria, as you know much better than I do. There are different ways of expressing yourself in different parts of the country.
Well, back to your visit to Nigeria, for instance. You've been here so many times, but this time around, the purpose of this visit was again to share your knowledge in what we've called peacebuilding. Mm-hmm. And you've also been involved in resolving conflicts. Tell us about the experience, how it's been.
Well, this trip is a very short trip, far too short, very sadly, because of pressures on my diary to be somewhere else early next week. But I had the privilege this morning of speaking at the IIP conference on peaceful elections. To use the expression that His Excellency, the President of the Federal Republic, used during his own speech, he talked about credible, peaceful, fair and just elections. And those are powerful words. And I had the great privilege of being invited to speak to a wonderful group of extraordinary leaders, including past heads of state and others, on the question of the morality of politics, if you like.
Some people tend to think that you can't speak of morality in politics because there's always something out there in politics. In fact, they describe politics as something you get into if you'd rather not bother too much about morals.
I think that's completely wrong. Yes, of course, in every sphere of life, including in the church, you get people who are not very moral. That's because the Bible teaches us that we're sinners, and we need to recognize that and repent of our sins. But in politics, you also see people who are conscious of their own weakness, but are motivated by a desire to serve their country and to bring people to a better place. And I think politics is an honourable profession. I have to think that a lot of my family were in politics. And I think it's an honourable profession where sometimes people do the wrong thing. They do that in every profession. I risk saying that perhaps even the odd television broadcaster does not always do things in the best way.
All right, still speaking of politics, you've done so much work and you've been to Africa so many times, and I'm thinking, yes, you do know a little bit about how the politics is practiced in Africa. Now, many African nations tend to copy the ideals of the West, which may or may not fit into their own local situations. And there is the challenge of divisions in politics on ethnic and religious lines.
I think you've asked a very profound question there, a very difficult question. First of all, as you know better than I do, and I'm always very cautious about lecturing people from outside, when we talk of Africa, the diversity within Africa is extraordinary. It's an enormous continent with vast numbers of people. As if we talk in Europe, different countries do things in different ways. But the question of the model we follow is one for each country to decide. But there are various principles. The principles of human dignity, of the right of the weak and the poor and the marginal to be heard and to express themselves, of the need for those who are sometimes excluded from a voice in society, in some societies, to be given that voice. That will be expressed in different cultures in different ways, but it needs to be just, it needs to be peaceful, it needs to be credible, and it needs to be honouring of the dignity of the people of the country. Now, people sometimes use the excuse and say, well, this is a Western model, so we're not going to follow it, when what they mean is, I want to be in power forever. Those are two very different questions. Yes, every country must find its own right model. If you look across Europe, you'll find different models of politics in different countries, of political government. But the common features they seek for are features around human dignity and the common good.
Right. Is politics necessarily conflictual? Because people say you must have these conflicts in politics.
That's a good question. I think it probably is, because I've sometimes defined elections as civil war carried on by other means, by peaceful means. They should be peaceful. How do people who have ideas, who have a vision for their country, how do they reach a place where they can begin to exercise the power that is necessary to put that vision into action? Let's assume they're a good person with a good vision of the common good, of serving their country. How do they do it in a way that they get to a place where they can make a difference? Well, they'll be in competition with other people with other ideas, And inevitably, those ideas will sometimes clash. And so they will need to find a way of resolving those clashes peacefully, so that the people of the country say, well, I prefer him to her, or her to him.
Sometimes when you have these conflicts, especially talking about good governance, people look to the clergy to stay on the path of truth and admonish leaders. But sometimes the clergy gets sucked in as well.
Yes, that is true. There are two great faults in clergy involvement in politics. One is that we just say, oh, it's not our job. We will keep distance from this dirty business. And then when evil things are done, we've got nothing to say, because we've stepped back from the process. That happened in Germany in the 1930s. The church never criticized the evil things that the Nazi Party were advocating. And as a result, when the Nazis were in government, the church found itself powerless. The other fault is to get too involved and say God is on this side or God is on that side. You can sometimes say God is not on the side of someone who's promising to do evil things. But between when you have democratic, properly led parties that may have very different views, you can't say, well, God is a socialist or God is a right-winger. You can only say God is judge and God is righteous. And then you call people to seek righteousness and justice. The prophet Amos in the Old Testament says beautifully, let justice flow down like rivers and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That is what the church needs to be saying.
All right. In the world today, we've seen a steady rise in religious extremism, threatening nations and communities. What's the role of the church in helping to change this narrative?
You've made a very powerful point. The church has a role, a very important role, but so do other faiths, other faith leaders. When you look around the world over the last 40 years, you see that religious extremism has increased in every single global faith. We've seen examples of extremism in Buddhism, in Christianity, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Judaism. Every global faith has suffered from a very small minority who've got caught up in extremism. There must be not only religious but sociological and economic reasons for this. There's a whole complex of reasons which I've not studied sufficiently. But we see it in every faith. I spoke on this a couple of years ago at a big conference in Europe, in Switzerland. And I said, we must first admit where our own faith has gone wrong. As Jesus says, you take the beam out of your own eye before you start trying to remove the splinter from your neighbour's eye. And we must first of all say, we've been wrong in such and such an area, but then in every faith, the religious leaders must take responsibility. Our temptation, you know, is when there's an extremist act from people of our own faith. Let's go back 20 years, a place called Srebrenica in the Balkans. So-called Christian militia killed 7,000 Muslims there. Terrible massacre, the worst massacre in Europe since 1945. And it's easy to say, well, they're not real Christians. But actually we need to say what they did is deeply evil. But what is it within ourselves, within our own faith, that made them think it was the right thing to do? And we have to address that. And every faith has to address the areas in its own faith where people have gone wrong.
You think there's enough harmony among leaders of the various faiths as to address this malaise?
I think more are doing so. I think we've got a long way to go. I find increasing numbers of Christian leaders who recognize the faults in our history, the terrible things that we'd done in the past. I mean, the clear one which affected this part of the world very deeply for over 100 years was slavery, often carried out even by Christian groups. And people are recognizing that. And I think I've met a number of Muslim leaders who have risked their lives constantly to try and resist extremism in their own faith. I've met Hindu leaders, I've met Jewish leaders, I've met Buddhist leaders doing the same. So I think it is there, but we need to be more purposeful, more intentional, more deliberate about doing it.
Would you agree that there is rise in cases of what's been called Islamophobia?
There's also been rising cases of Christianophobia and anti-Semitism. We've had a lot of talk about that in this last few months in the United Kingdom. And yes, but that springs from people's fear of that which they do not understand, of the other. And it applies to all minorities. I've found myself having to cancel visits to particular parts of the world because to go there would so annoy the local majority against the Christians that if I went, more Christians would be killed. That's happened to me quite recently. And there's no reason for that. I'm a fairly harmless kind of character. But there is fear and persecution of the other in many parts of the world. And sadly, when you look around the world, the faith that has been most persecuted in recent years has been Christians.
Well, coupled with this is the issue of migration. And people
yes.
so worried about people from other parts coming to take over, as they say, take over their...
No, absolutely. The interesting thing, of course, I was doing some studying on this earlier this year and last year. The interesting thing is that there's a very clear pattern that people are more frightened of immigration when there is almost no immigration in their area than they are when there's lots of immigration. Because if there are lots of immigration, the person who's the immigrant who lives next door is not an immigrant, it's Cyril or Justin. It's my mate who I have a chat with in the evening, or my wife has a cup of tea with his grown-up daughter, or whatever it happens to be. They become human beings. I remember someone, when I was a parish priest, saying to me, "We need to stop immigration from Africa." And I said, "But you're a really good friend of so-and-so," which was, in the parish I was in, was the only African family living in the parish. "Oh, he's not an immigrant. That is Jack." Well, actually, Jack was an immigrant, but the moment they saw the human being, they didn't think of them as a thing. It was their mate, their friend. So immigration and integration must go together. If people move to a country, they must learn the official language of the country. If they live in a country, they must learn its customs and learn not to offend. It's very challenging. And we also have to protect the receiving communities. You go to many places, you would know that, in this country where, even within this enormous country, settler and indigens, that's a question that comes up quite often, isn't it? Two phrases, right. Two words. The fact is, if people move into an area, suddenly people find the schools are too full, or public transport is stressed, or things have changed. There's more people needing local resources, and they feel frightened by this. So in England, we need, where people are moving into an area, to support the people of that area who've been there for many years, as well as, not instead of, as well as supporting the people coming into the area. But we also have to be careful. Immigration is a frightening thing for people who are used to knowing everyone around them and knowing how they think. So let's not be judgmental of people who are frightened of immigration. Let's help them to see that immigrants are not a threat.
What's the best way to address these two issues? Fear, immigration, and of course the religious divide, getting people to unite, even if they are of different faiths?
Well, one of the things we say when we're seeking to address these issues is you've got to be top down, bottom up, and middle out. So top down, there has to be clear leadership, really clear leadership. Too many leaders see division and fear as an opportunity to increase power. So they define themselves not by what they're in favour of, but by what they're against. I'm against immigrants. I'm against this group. I'm against that group. Those of you who support me, we will all be against that group. And then they get fearful people will join them. That's the top down. We need really good leadership that says, I'm never going to do that. I will never use fear as a tool for political advantage. Bottom up, we need grassroots work through churches, through faith communities. We have a program in England called Near Neighbours. It's incredibly basic. It's people of different faiths and cultures and backgrounds meeting together in drafty, cold church halls to help each other with particular problems, to support each other, care for each other's elderly people, and they do that together. And they discover that they belong to each other. And middle out, we need the infrastructure of society needs to be designed to reduce fear, never to increase it. You look at some areas, Northern Ireland, in the United Kingdom, where for many generations the schooling has been segregated. And you will meet people of 12, 13, 14 years of age who all through school have never met someone of the other community because the schools are segregated. Used to be true in the southern states of the United States of America between black and white. So if you've never met someone, all you hear is the stories, and fear increases. Middle out involves changing the infrastructure, the way we work, so that we work together.
You've been a regular visitor to Nigeria. Have you had any cause to worry that this country was on the brink of a permanent disintegration along religious lines?
There's been moments of worry. But as I say, the longer I've gone on here, the less I understand. Or at least the more I know that I don't understand. If you like, I move from unconscious ignorance to conscious ignorance. And the more I go on here, I realise that Nigeria does sometimes walk very close to the edge and look over the edge. Sometimes they even seem to step over the edge but not fall. Don't know how they do that. And then they come back. So I'm less fearful than I was in the past. Because I think within this country there is such an enormous talent and capacity that somehow it brings the situation back. But it can be very, very dangerous and very difficult. And I think Nigerians are aware, because of their painful, awful experience between 1967 and 1970, the Civil War. They know the cost of war. Many older people know the cost of war. And because of that, they know how strongly they must resist it.
Well, it's said that you enjoy some form of cordial relationship with the current president of Nigeria, President Buhari.
Yes, as with a number of his predecessors, yes.
All right. So, in your discussions, do you raise some of these issues? People would want to know, well, interested in knowing, if you have a friend who's a leader of his nation.
I think, first of all, as in this, I'm very privileged with the job I hold. I have many privileges. I meet a lot of very senior politicians. Rule one, you don't say what you discuss.
Right.
Because they are entitled to know that what they say to you is confidential.
Okay, right. Oh, well, as a priest, it's confidential. But
it's confidential.
Could this be because politicians often change their minds?
Yes. I hope that I would never not say something because I liked the person I was talking to. I hope I would always be transparent. I hope I do that with British politicians. I hope I do that with politicians around the world, including in Nigeria. But when you're addressing the head of state of a country of almost 200 million people, this great country, to insult the head of state, to be rude to the head of state, is to be rude to the country. They're the head of state. It's like being rude to the Queen. If I'm rude to His Excellency the President, if I insult him, I'm not just insulting Muhammadu Buhari. I'm insulting the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. And that means I'm insulting every Nigerian of all political views. So here or in other places, I try to be courteous, confidential, and respectful, even where I disagree. But I will say where I disagree and where I have concerns.
All right, Archbishop, let's leave politics for the time being.
That's a bit worrying.
And come to the church and return to the church. And,
can we stick with politics? It's less complicated.
Right. But again, with the church, lots of values have been questioned. And where I'm going to actually is the question of sexuality.
I thought you might ask that.
Right. And there is today no one clear-cut agreement over what it should be. Times have changed, and the ordinary, as they used to say, good church values that people grew up in have changed, and there are so many things now, and this has led to divisions even.
It has. You put your finger on it very clearly. The church has always argued over values. If you go back in the history of the Anglican Communion in the 1920s and 30s, we were arguing ferociously on the issues of contraception, whether it was justified ever to use contraception. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, we argued bitterly about divorce, whether divorce could ever be proper. And more recently, we've argued about human sexuality. I think, let me be clear, the Church of England's rules and canons, and in fact the law of the land in England, by Act of Parliament, says that no same-sex marriage can be celebrated in a Church of England church. It's quite clear. The church rules say, the canons as they're called, say that marriage is a lifelong union of one man to one woman. And the law of the land says even if someone conducted a marriage service in a church, it would not be a valid marriage if the two people are of the same gender. So let's be clear, that's quite clear.
The Anglican Communion is quite clear about that.
Well, the Church of England is.
All right. Well,
other parts of the Anglican Communion have slightly different views, or quite different views. We really struggle with that, in common with every other major denomination, global denomination. The culture in many parts of the global north has changed so dramatically over sexuality. In every way, attitudes to divorce are completely different to what they were. Attitudes to living together before you're married, a man and a woman living together as if they were married, before they were married. When in the 1951 census in the UK, there were so few people who were what they call cohabiting that it wasn't even measured Today there's 5 million, not far short of 10% of the population. And inevitably the church, those views seep into the church, because everyone in the church is also in the world around. So the church struggles when culture and practice change in the world around them. But in the Church of England, we're doing a huge study starting with the Bible. What does the Bible say about these matters? Looking at theology, how do we understand the nature of God? Looking at science, how do we understand the science of human sexuality? And looking at history, how do we deal with difference? How do we deal with how historically have we dealt with disagreement? And a load of other questions. We've got a bunch of scholars, the best scholars, working on this. And my understanding, I hold the same view as the vast majority of Christians, well over 90% of Christians today. My understanding is that Christian marriage is the lifelong union of a man and a woman, to the exclusion of all others.
Right. So when sometimes you have the law of a state in conflict with the stand
of the church?
Of a church, how do you resolve that? For instance, there are different countries in the world that have gone ahead and taken a different stance.
Well, including the United Kingdom.
Right. And you do have countries like Nigeria who have taken a definite step about that.
Yep.
Say it's not permissible. And sometimes these lead to conflicts. We've had cases where some Western countries had insisted that some African countries had to change their views on sexuality if they needed any aid from it. Is this moral?
I do not believe you can punish collectively. In other words, if a country has an attitude to human sexuality with which you disagree, I don't think you can withdraw aid that might give them support in the fight against malaria because you don't like their attitude to sexuality. I don't think that's right, because that's punishing one group for what you see as the wrong choice of another group. I do think that in these discussions, the biggest struggle is not to hate one another. We cannot, in England still today, the biggest cause of death amongst teenagers, it may be the second biggest, is homophobic bullying. In other words, bullying people at school because of their sexuality. And they get so bullied they end up killing themselves. That cannot be right. And the Church of England, we educate 1 million children in our schools. We have a massive campaign against homophobic bullying. What we want to see is that people learn to love one another and to disagree well, and not to hate each other. And I think when we allow hatred in and violence coming from either side, we've lost sight of Jesus Christ.
Right. Now, how does the church intend to resolve these issues of divisions in what's frequently called the body of Christ?
The divisions on a lot more than sexuality. There are some very profound divisions on the nature of priesthood, the nature. Can women be priests and bishops?
That's part of it as well.
That's a very big one. We have, I think it's 16 or 17 women bishops now, having started in 2014. And many churches, Roman Catholic Church, would say that's completely wrong. Well, first of all, we start with Jesus. Everything starts with Jesus and the Bible, and learning to love one another and saying, yes, I disagree with you profoundly, but look over there, there's a man there who's got no home. There's a family there who's got no food. There's a child there who, if we don't support them, will die of malaria. Of course, you and I disagree profoundly, but let's go and help them and go on talking about our disagreement. That's how the church makes progress towards unity.
Sometimes people have said, yes, it's good to believe in the existence of God and to worship Him through whatever faith. But again, they say there are societies that, to a large extent, do not bother about that, and yet they have made outstanding progress in governance and
Yes,
human development.
indeed.
Does that detract?
Which ones were you thinking of?
Well, not to mention names, but I'm sure.
Because
you do
I
know
really
that,
struggle to
right?
think of any. I can think of societies that are now very secular, but whose basic assumptions about right and wrong is built on the Judeo-Christian ethic. That would be true in much of Europe, including the United Kingdom. I can think of societies that are distinctly atheist, like North Korea, where I don't think one would say they'd made a huge success of it.
Well, it would be difficult to know that anyway, because it's a closed society.
Well, yes, but we do know that Christians there are often persecuted. I can think of when I was first married, my wife and I, in our first 2 years, I was working in the oil industry, we had a bit of holiday every summer. We smuggled Bibles to Christians in Eastern Europe, hidden in the secret compartment of a camping van. 1,000 Bibles each year. And we smuggled them to church groups who were forbidden to have the Bible. Why? Because they were Christians. So, first of all, I question the premise of your argument. Secondly, I think I would want to say that even if you're right, the question of the truth of Christian faith and other faiths is a question of fundamental truth. Christians believe the human being is created by God, to know God, to love God, and to be with God forever in worship with God. And the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus and his ascension and the sending of the Spirit is to bring the life of Christ into the world, the light of Christ. Well, you don't get away from that by saying, I don't believe in it. You may as well say, I don't believe the world is round. I was talking to a politician not long ago who said, well, you have to understand, Archbishop, British politician, he said, you have to understand I'm an atheist. And I said, I understand that. You've said it publicly on a number of occasions, but God is not an atheist. You may not believe in him, but he believes in you. We Christians seek to proclaim truth, and they must live in a way that demonstrates the truth they proclaim. Our great weakness is not our lack of faith, it's that we don't live out that faith. Gandhi once was asked, what did he think of Christian society? And he said, it would be wonderful if it existed.
Well, what's the key here in human relations, no matter what faith here, could be Christians, Muslims, Buddhists? What's the key in interpersonal relations, humanity, what you look at when you speak?
The human being, this marvelous, extraordinary, wonderful thing, which is the human being, where there are over 7 billion of us in the world and no 2 of them are identical. Even identical twins aren't totally identical in their behavior, in their attitudes, in their thoughts. And so when you're dealing with people who disagree very profoundly, when I'm doing well, and I have my good days and my bad days, when I'm dealing with them, I remember I'm talking to this miracle, which is called a human being, who is loved by God, even if they don't know it. Even if they don't want to know it, they are loved by God. And I try and see in that the reason to love them. Do you remember there was a wedding in England a bit earlier this year? Prince Harry and
Yes, I do.
the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, as they now are. I had the privilege of being involved. Was it televised yet? Was it on the TV?
Mm-hmm.
It was. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the preacher?
Yes, and that also demonstrates what we've been talking about. It was unusual, and there were some who actually felt that a few feathers were rustled.
Oh, a few feathers were ruffled. It was great. It was the most wonderful. The royal family, they were listening, and they.
It was unusual for the royal family
It was,
to be.
but the royal family's heard it all before, and they are wonderful, wonderful people, and they were perfectly happy. But the extraordinary thing about that sermon, it was about love, and how love is experienced and comes from Jesus Christ. It was heard by 1.5 billion people around the world. People in pubs in South London and in Glasgow and other places who'd never gone to church. I happen to know 2 stories of people who turned around at the end of that sermon and said, if that's what it's about, I want to know this Jesus. And yeah, that's where you start. You start with the person of Jesus and the love he gives us for one another. When Christians love, the world changes. But what a tragedy that we forget that.
Love is the key here.
Love is the key. And love because the people we are engaging with are made by Jesus Christ. What did Jesus do when he was being hammered to the cross? Said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. What love is that?
Tough, isn't it? The principle of turning the other cheek.
I was thinking this yesterday.
This world?
I had a week where there were a number of difficult things that happened. Threats, quite serious threats at one point, which meant I had to change some plans. And your first reaction is, I'd really like those people to get what's coming to them. And then I went and prayed and said, Lord, you know, these people, their behaviour. And the Lord, I get a nudge inside me to go and look at the Bible and to see that it says, if I say I have no sin, I lie and the truth is not in me. But if I confess my sin, God is faithful and just and will forgive me my sin. It says that in John's first letter. And I went back and said, Lord, I'm sorry, I'm not loving them as you love them. So he corrected me.
All right. So I suppose this, as we round off, it's something I've been trying not to ask, but then, if anyone were to say to you and say, what's it about Nigeria that keeps bringing you here?
Nigerians. It's the people. It's the people. They are... I remember the first time my wife met some Nigerians, because I'd been many times before she met any Nigerians. And a bunch of Nigerians came to a meal with us, and the noise level was incredible. My wife was in the kitchen, she said, we were moving, I was helping her, we were moving food in and out and feeding people. She said, are they going to get into a fight? I said, no, this is just Nigerian. They're full of passion. They're full of enthusiasm. They're full of commitment. They care about things. Why do I like coming back? It's the people. There's Nigerian churches in London. When I go there, I just come back with my ears ringing and my heart on fire.
That's the expression. Well, the Most Reverend and Right Honourable Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, it's been interesting talking to you, and I'm looking forward to this opportunity again.
Thank you so much. And, it's very nice of you.
Would like to say thank you for coming.
I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Well, that's our program. Next week, we'll reach you again on One-on-One. I am Cyril Stober. Bye for now.